Welcome to part 2 of today's lecture. So now we continue with scheduling. Scheduling is an important part of the entire disaster management process. Disasters take place in specific locations, stationary locations, while response to these disasters require a high degree of coordination, because remember, as we mentioned before, it's a multidisciplinary task. Many agencies are involved. So in order to minimize confusion and chaos, it's necessary to have proper allocation of resources and prioritization of tasks. So scheduling essentially involves the following. Firstly, there must be identification and definition of the current tasks. So the teams involved, the planning team involved, needs to be able to assist in the clear definition of the tasks that need to be carried out at any particular point in time. Tasks must also be prioritized. It must be determined which tasks need to be addressed first, second, third, and so on. And this is necessary because many times you find that because it's a multidisciplinary process and many teams are involved, one task may be dependent on the completion of another task. It cannot be carried out before another task is completed. What are the benefits of scheduling? Task forces to adapt the priorities of their assigned tasks to the current situation in order to allow for a fast reaction on unpredictable changes. So in other words, if you have proper scheduling taking place, you can expect a fast reaction to any emergencies taking place. Scheduling also facilitates the proper organization of the tasks where one task is mutually dependent on another. For example, a fire would need to be put out before medical attention can be given to victims. Scheduling helps to avoid the idling of resources. Because of lacking assignments, sometimes you may have teams sitting there with resources and they haven't been notified what needs to be done, where they need to go, etc. So at times like that, you find resources would sit idling. Time would be wasting while the emergency is ongoing. Scheduling helps to avoid inadequate prioritization of the tasks at hand. For example, this may also happen because of inadequate data or information regarding the situation. So if information doesn't reach the critical and key persons involved, for example, at the data coordination center, if the information does not reach them, they cannot quickly and accurately send out the information to the key persons on the field. Scheduling also helps to avoid the duplication of work. This can often happen again. Two different teams, for example, two emergency medical teams, one with the military, one with the fire services, they may both end up at the same scene to provide emergency medical services. So then you may have some level of confusion occurring if scheduling isn't properly done. Budgeting is also very critical to disaster management. Many times you find governments would have to anticipate and prepare for sudden adverse shocks to their income, their national income, and their wealth. Some of the ways in which a disaster can impact a nation can be by reducing their national savings. For example, if the agricultural industry has been destroyed or various industries have been destroyed by disaster, their gross national product would be reduced. You can have increased losses. So when damage occurs now, you find that there would be increased losses, there would be the need to repair, to rebuild, etc. So what many countries tend to do is they tend to prepare ahead of time in a number of ways. One way might be to prepare through the setting up of disaster insurance. So many countries actually have disaster insurances in place that they can draw upon in times of disaster. Alternatively, there can be contingency or emergency funds set up in order for this to happen. For example, Trinidad and Tobago has our heritage and stabilization funds, and this is one of the reasons for that fund being there. I want you to look with me. This is just a simple chart. This is U.S. federal funding based on disaster relief and recovery by department. So this was for the period 2011 to 2013. So we're not going to look at everything on the chart, but I just want to highlight to you some of the significant areas of spending on this chart. For example, we find a significant portion in terms of millions of dollars here through the Ministry of Agriculture. So agriculture in times of disaster would have to be a very important area for funding. Food, the generation and provision of food for any nation is important. Similarly, if you look at Homeland Security would a lot of money is being spent in this area for this. This is their internal national security. Secondly, transportation, a lot of money is being spent on transportation here. Additionally, we see housing and urban development. Okay, and then of course there is a fair amount on defense. So that defense would usually involve a focus on their national defense against foreign threats. Okay, so these are some of the major areas of focus, as you can see here, and many times this would often be the same in many countries around the world. Some other strategies for increasing a disaster budget may include the reduction of public expenditure. So government expenditure would be reduced in certain areas that the governments have determined might be less critical than other areas. So that would really be intended to increase public savings in order to prepare for disaster. Additionally, there may be an increase in taxes in order to generate money towards the preparation for disaster management. Another strategy for preparing to manage any disaster is what we call mutual aid. Now there are two types of mutual aid we're going to look at, specifically external mutual aid and internal mutual aid. Now mutual aid really is by definition the cooperation between two or more entities and the agreement amongst and between them in order to assist each other in times of disaster. So let's look specifically first here at external mutual aid. This involves arrangements made at a government level between one nation and another, or one organization and another. Some examples of external mutual aid may actually, first of all, be in the form of legislation. Now, this is what we have here is an example of a U.S. piece of legislation, external mutual aid legislation. We have the U.S. Foreign Aid Assistance Act, and the agency responsible for the implementation of that act is USAID. The purpose of the legislation is for the U.S. agencies to provide assistance to friendly countries, organizations, and voluntary non-profit relief organizations. So please note, this would not facilitate any assistance to anyone or any organization or country that the U.S. deems to be an enemy. Another U.S. example is the Robert Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Act. The lead agencies in charge would be the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and FEMA. And the main function is to provide aid between the United States and neighboring countries. So here neighboring countries would involve countries like Mexico and Canada. Mexico to the south, Canada to the north. As mentioned before, not all types of mutual aid are pieces of legislation. Sometimes they may be different types of agreements. For example, agreements between the US government and Mexico to cooperate with each other in times of natural disasters. The agencies responsible for the implementation of this agreement on the American side, FEMA and USAID. On the Mexico side, Mexico Secretariat for Foreign Relations. And the function of the agreement is the exchange of information and personnel in times of disaster, specifically concentrated along their borders. An example of an agreement within the Caribbean, we have the Caribbean regional agencies agreeing to provide flood assistance to Guyana. Several agencies are responsible for the implementation. We have CAREC, CIDERA, Caribbean Environment Health Institute, and PAHO. And the function is to provide immediate health assistance to Guyana in the wake of floods. So for many of you, you may recall that Georgetown in Guyana is located in a coastal region that is actually below sea level. So for many years, they have always been known to be prone to flooding. Internal mutual aid are arrangements made at the national level between different jurisdictions or different organizations. So all of these arrangements or agreements are happening within national borders. Trinidad and Tobago has an emergency mutual aid scheme. So this is actually legislation. Coming out of that piece of legislation is the establishment of the Trinidad and Tobago Emergency Mutual Aid Association. So this association is responsible for the implementation of the provisions of that act. And the purpose of the act is to establish and develop mutual aid assistance in case of industrial or community emergency situations. They may be natural or man-made. And the purpose is to sensitize and educate the members of the association as well as the general public to disaster threats and to assist in the education about pre-planning, pre-incident planning. Another example of internal mutual aid, this is a US example, is Emergency Management Assistance Compact. The lead organization is NEMA, National Emergency Management Association, and the function is to facilitate a quick response amongst US states to assist each other. And the purpose of that is, in other words, to cut out all the red tape to facilitate a quick response. So at this point, I would like to thank you for your attention. You are now required to please proceed to any activities that have been provided for this week. Thank you.